why we saw all of these moves. Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Ukraine, all of these things are moved towards increasing the Western Empire's position near Russia and China to encircle them. Hello everybody, I'm Mango Thunderslice, and today we're talking about the future of warfare and geopolitics in the coming decade, 2020 to 2030, and why that's significant for every living person on the planet, right? We've had an interesting 100-year run in this country, and, especially since the end of the Cold War, a lot of, mainstream historians said it was the end of history, that communism had been defeated, and now basically neoliberalism was the sole hyperpower dominating force, and the Western Empire and NATO essentially by default was the hegemon in controlling the world. Obviously, centered around the military power of the United States, right, and allied with Europe and the UK and whatnot. And one of those allies in NATO has been Turkey, right? Turkey, since basically, the Ottoman Empire was defeated in World War I, has been kind of somewhat of a vassal state of the Western Empire. And they've been bucking the trend, several trends in a lot of ways. And, they've been playing fast and loose with the migration crisis, threatening Europe with millions of refugees if they don't get billions of dollars in payments, and demanding to be admitted to the European Union, which is essentially allow all of those migrants that are inside of Turkey to have free travel throughout Europe. And Erdogan, whatever, how you pronounce his name, I don't really care, because the guy's kind of a douche. And but in any case, as douchey as he is fairly astute at playing off the great power conflict that is materializing. And in retrospect, this is kind of obviously inevitable, and it's interesting to look at 9/11 and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan as essentially the military-industrial complex and the empire essentially knew the rising power of China specifically, and obviously, Russia has been a great power for a long time, but they kind of assumed after the fall of the Soviet Union that they could just take it over. Slowly, through their organizations like they have always, especially the George Soros types, with Boris Yeltsin, the first president of Russia in the post-Soviet years. They really thought that they had it made. They really thought that they could just, privatize everything, throw in their little cronies, start, making the social unrest, and start carving off pieces of the country, and eventually get, the country under full banking control of the West. And the problem was Mr. Vladimir Putin came along and became president, I believe, literally December 31st, 1999. And, he has led the Russian forces to a point where now, even though their military spending is only a tiny fraction of ours with our military-industrial complex and the $700-800 billion we spend every year, they have managed to place themselves in a position to check the entire movement forward of the Western Empire towards encirclement, containment, controlling, and conquering Russia and China. And so it's a very interesting time, especially right now, and like many other times in history, warfare is defined by the technologies that are being used, right? And so we're going to read just a couple articles, but essentially it's we all of these toppling of governments from Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan, didn't, I guess, really have that much of a government. It was the Taliban. But, in Ukraine, for example, which is, of course, the hot button issue right now, Ukraine specifically was overthrown to basically put the Western Empire's forces on Russia's doorstep. And it's hilarious that they get so mad about Crimea specifically that amidst all this chaos and, Western-induced turmoil and overthrowing the government, using literal neo-Nazis, right? Like people who, like the Svoboda Party, is basically modern neo-Nazis. Is the same, George Soros, who says that, he as a Jew helped the Nazis, and maybe it wasn't the Nazis, but he was in Hungary, but maybe it was the Nazis. Basically take the wealth from other Jews. So, and he said he doesn't feel bad about it at all. George Soros is a good example of a window into the mind of these maniacs and how psychopathic they are. And Ukraine, we've been doing military drills on Russia's border for years and years, and now essentially we've reached a point where the empire will go no further, right? We're not going to see any more toppling of governments in the brazen ways that have come before. If anything, these proxy wars are going to get a lot more subtle, and the realm is going to be in cyberspace. It's going to be very much an information war, not just in terms of the propaganda wars that we've already seen for a long time and have ramped up in the last couple of years with the whole Russiagate and now Ukrainegate. The empire is trying desperately to cover its tracks and mask the fact that it seeks to unilaterally dominate the entire world and conquer Russia and China. It's very, very clear that that's the case. Of course, they'll use all this flowery language and, diplomatic, newspeak to make it seem like, the only priority of the Western Empire and NATO is just humanitarian reasons, but it's really just a mask for a naked grab for power, and that grab for power is now been halted by the sheer advance of technology, military technology with Russia and China. So basically we'll start with this one. NATO faces a fresh quandary as Turkey tips toward Russia, from the Wall Street Journal. Subtitle: Alliance strains to resolve tensions with President Erdogan, who has threatened to evict U.S. bases if Trump administration imposes new sanctions. Turkey's president has warned that he would evict U.S. forces from 2 military bases in his country if Washington imposes new sanctions on his government, creating a quandary for the NATO alliance as it seeks to cope with Ankara's deepening ties to Russia. In a television interview this month, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said that if the U.S. punishes Turkey for its purchase of a Russian air defense system, then, quote, if necessary, we may close Incirlik and Kurasik, installations where the U.S. keeps nuclear weapons and operates critical radar. The declaration elicited an anxious reaction from U.S. Defense Secretary Mark Esper, who said it raised questions about Turkey's dedication to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Quote, they have that inherent right to house or not house NATO bases or foreign troops, Mr. Esper said. But again, I think this becomes an alliance matter, your commitment to the alliance, if indeed they are serious about what they are saying. Turkey, which has NATO's biggest standing army after the U.S., has taken steps that have put it at odds with Washington and the rest of the alliance, including sending its army into northern Syria to fight a U.S. allied militia and purchasing the Russian S-400 missile system. Quote, it feels like watching a car crash in slow motion, end quote, a Western diplomat in Turkey said. And this system is a big part of the whole theme of this video and the theme of, the next decade of warfare in this world is these very advanced systems that are being produced by Russia. The S-400 system, for example, which is not even the latest generation of that system and technology. When Israel tried to send airstrikes and basically attack Syria unilaterally, it was this system that intercepted some of their missiles, and it's this system that could shoot down essentially any and all fighter planes that Israel has in its arsenal. So it was this system being purchased by Syria, which completely stopped the ability of the Western Empire to, unilaterally conquer the place and destroy it with airstrikes and missiles, as with Israel as well. It basically nullified Israel and the U.S.'s ability to go in and conquer the country. And of course, the whole time it hasn't really been overt. It's been this, ISIS and Free Syrian Army and training these moderate rebels, which are really just terrorists from Libya and the wider Middle East, right? But it's this particular system, the S-400, is a very, very effective system, and it it apparently has stymied the military-industrial complex. Continuing with the article. The Trump administration has sought to cajole Mr. Erdogan in a bid to prevent Ankara from knitting closer ties with Moscow amid concerns that treating him like a pariah would push Turkey further into Russia's orbit, U.S. officials said. But President Trump has had to contend with angry U.S. lawmakers who have voted through a string of bills aimed at punishing Turkey. Which is fine with me, but anyway, it's funny because after a century, they finally recognized the Armenian genocide, right? Turkey committed, there's all much made about the Holocaust, and for good reason. But there's been plenty of other genocides that have happened in the world, including the Christian Armenians by the Muslim Turks, and it was only formally recognized by the Congress a couple months ago. And so with that, they are implementing these sanctions. Nominally, it's to help the Kurds. Our friends, the Kurds, are getting attacked by Turkey, and, it's against this Obama-era holdover humanitarian imperialism, right? We need to go invade another country because we're trying to help people. It's it's usually bullshit. In fact, I struggle to think of a single time when it wasn't bullshit. Continuing, Mr. Trump in mid-November hosted his Turkish counterpart at the White House, calling him a, quote, very good friend. This month, however, he signed a defense bill that included sanctions against Turkey, notably blocking delivery of U.S. fighter jets ordered by Turkey. The Trump administration has yet to spell out the scope of sanctions against Turkey, but U.S. and European officials say the time is running out to try to repair Turkey-U.S. relations and appease tensions within NATO. We don't want the sanctions on Turkey, but they will happen, a senior U.S. official said. It will hurt Turkey. Here's a picture of the S-400 defense system being unloaded from a Russian plane. It's essentially a truck-mounted radar system and missile launchers, and with those just modular kind of portable systems, they can essentially put it, anywhere they need it. And it's a very effective system. Anyway, continuing. Alliance leaders have been basking in the success of a meeting in London this month where they celebrated the alliance's 70th anniversary by patching up rifts and reaching agreements on strategic issues and defense initiatives. Mr. Trump, who has heavily criticized NATO and questioned its value, praised allies for increasing spending. The run-up to the meeting had been rocky after Turkey invaded northern Syria to attack Kurdish fighters that the U.S. and European militaries had been helping fight Islamic State. The invasion, which came after a phone call between Messrs. Erdogan and Trump, prompted French President Emmanuel Macron to say NATO was experiencing brain death because decisions were being taken outside the alliance. Still, at the meeting, there was little public criticism of Turkey, which said it would endorse a new defense plan for Poland and the Baltic countries that it had threatened to block, demanding recognition of Kurdish armed groups as terrorists in return. But the dispute quickly resurfaced. The main bone of contention is Turkey's purchase of the S-400 system, which the Pentagon views as a security threat to NATO. The U.S. has suspended deliveries of the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter to Turkey and excluded Turkish aerospace companies from a contract to supply fuselage and other parts, saying Russia could use the system's radar to spy on and assess the stealthy aircraft's capabilities. Turkish officials have proposed setting up an expert committee with the U.S. or under NATO supervision to look into the S-400 issue and propose remedies. But U.S. officials say Washington would rather pay substantial compensation than deliver a single F-35 to Turkey and jeopardize the integrity of the multi-billion-dollar system. Highlighting the impasse, Turkey carried out a test of the S-400 system, deployed at an airbase near Ankara, against U.S.-made F-16 jets in late November and said it might order Russian combat aircraft if the F-35 delivery ban wasn't lifted. Turkish national security interests must be regarded as one of the primary issues for the U.S. and NATO, said Ahmet Berat Konkar, a Turkish lawmaker affiliated with Mr. Erdogan's ruling AK party and the deputy head of Turkey's delegation to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. Quote, if this cannot be openly guaranteed and maintained by concrete action for Turkey, new cracks may open inside the NATO alliance. End quote. Some European allies bristle that NATO uses language similar to Turkey's, which says that its invasion of northern Syria is for national security interests, and voice concerns that the West's alliance gave Turkey too much leeway to expand its military partnership with Russia. Turkey, which is already coordinating with Russia in northern Syria, is now seeking to cooperate with Russia in war-torn Libya. And that, I don't really understand what they're talking about there. So, cooperating with Russia in Libya implies that there's the UN-backed government in Libya. Libya's in a civil war, right? Thanks to Hillary Clinton, the country went from the most prosperous nation in Africa to a hellhole where there's basically literal slaves being sold in slave markets. And there's a civil war between basically General, Haftar. Khalifa Haftar is leading kind of military charge from Benghazi against the capital Tripoli. And it's the government based out of Tripoli that is the UN-recognized government. So, I mean, what So Turkey is sending weapons and fighters now to Libya. It's ironic because it was Turkey that facilitated the Libyan fighters going to Syria back, when they were trying to overthrow Syria back in 2013, 2014. And now they've essentially switched the rat line around, and now they're just going from Syria through Turkey back to Libya. So it's the same game in reverse. And so basically, Greece also has now threatened to recognize the Khalifa Haftar and the other government that's fighting against the UN government. And so it's setting up this big Mediterranean conflict, and all of it really centers around the oil and gas rights in the Mediterranean. There's a lot of overlapping claims, and Turkey has used this opportunity to just outright claim them and say, we're going to start drilling. And basically Khalifa Haftar comes out and he's like, we're just going to sink your ships if you start drilling out here. So there's a lot of new conflicts brewing in the Mediterranean with Libya and Turkey, and especially Turkey's working with Russia. But as far as this sentence, cooperating with Russia in war-torn Libya, I don't know if that's necessarily the most accurate. Final sentence, quote, Turkey is playing a showdown and it is winning, a senior European diplomat at NATO said. So why is, first of all, it's like we have these bases in Turkey. How much money do we give to Turkey? How much leeway are we giving to Turkey? How much free stuff do they get just because we supposedly need this one base, Incirlik, or two bases, Incirlik and Kurasik, when, in fact, there's 30 potential bases all over surrounding that could serve as, an effective replacement. And there's, 50 nuclear weapons at the Incirlik base. More than that, it's where the Empire and the Cabal move the heroin from, and the opium from Afghanistan. They, funnel it through these bases in these rat lines, right? So it's not, again, all just, the righteous, good Americans fighting against the evil empire, right? It's all some deep geopolitics and shady stuff. But anyway, there's plenty of replacements. There's no reason for us to, kowtow to Turkey. But again, you start to realize, the way they've set up this graph right here, they've got all this info up here, right, that focuses on Russia, right? This is Russia right up here. So Turkey is, and these bases are some of the forward operating bases against, Russia in addition to the Middle East, just due to the geography. So yeah, that's the situation there. And why are these countries going with Russian weapons? What exactly is it that has switched, the world's biggest arms supplier and weapons dealer, the United States, to lose out to Russia? Well, despite spending $700 to $800 billion every year, Russia and China as well have essentially made some advances that are pretty astounding and extraordinary when it comes to aircraft and military technology. Here's one from Zero Hedge. Russian hypersonic nuclear weapon that can travel 27 times the speed of sound is now operational. It's official. Exactly 1 year after Putin oversaw the final test of Russia's most advanced hypersonic weapon, on Friday, the intercontinental weapon that can fly 27 times the speed of sound became operational, Russia's defense minister reported to President Vladimir Putin, bolstering the country's unprecedented nuclear strike capability, one which the U.S. has yet to match. And here's a photo, a rendering of it, the avant-garde hypersonic missile. As AP reports, Russia's defense minister Sergei Shoigu informed Putin that the first missile unit equipped with the avant-garde hypersonic glide vehicle entered combat duty. I congratulate you on this landmark event for the military and the entire nation, Shoigu said during a conference call with top military leaders. The avant-garde is launched atop an intercontinental ballistic missile, but unlike a regular missile warhead that follows with a predictable path after separation, it can make sharp maneuvers in the atmosphere en route to the target, making it much harder to intercept. Putin had previously described the avant-garde hypersonic glide vehicle as a technological breakthrough comparable to the 1957 Soviet launch of the first satellite. The new Russian weapon, which can deliver a nuclear payload to the U.S. in a matter of minutes, and a similar system being developed by China, have caused many sleepless nights for the Pentagon, which has pondered defense strategies. As the New York Times recently warned, hypersonics pose a different threat from ballistic missiles, according to those who have studied and worked on them, because they could be maneuvered in ways that confound existing methods of defense and detection. Not to mention, unlike most ballistic missiles, they would arrive in under 15 minutes, less time than anyone in Hawaii or elsewhere would need to meaningfully react. The Strategic Missile Forces Chief, General Sergei Karakiev, said during the call that the Avangard was put in duty with a unit in the Orenburg region in the southern Ural Mountains. The Avangard hypersonic missile was first unveiled by Putin, among other prospective weapon systems, in his State of the Nation address in March 2018, noting that its ability to make sharp maneuvers on its way to a target will render missile defense useless. Quote, "It heads to target like a meteorite, like a fireball," he said at the time. As AP reminds us, the Russian leader noted that Avangard is designed using new composite materials to withstand temperatures of up to 2,000 degrees Celsius, 3,632 degrees Fahrenheit, resulting from a flight through the atmosphere at hypersonic speeds. The military said the Avangard is capable of flying 27 times faster than the speed of sound and carries a nuclear weapon of up to 2 megatons. Putin explained that Russia had to develop the Avangard and other prospective weapons systems because of U.S. efforts to develop a missile defense system that he claimed could erode Russia's nuclear deterrent. And so this is really the key, because there was mutually assured destruction during the Cold War, right? We got nukes, you got nukes. If you fire a nuke, then we all die, right? So nobody's going to fire a nuke. That was kind of the balance of power, in a sense, that prevented war from happening, at least theoretically, and at least we're still here. And so with the advent of the missile defense system, and why all these bases, again, are around, Russia and moving, especially why we have, a presence in Afghanistan, which is thousands and thousands and thousands of miles away from us. Afghanistan is right there in the middle of the Eurasian continent, right next to China and right next to Russia, in a sense, right next to China, but very close to Russia as well. And, with the advent of the missile defense shield, that ended the theoretical balance of power in a mutually assured destruction. So these wacko maniacs in the Pentagon are thinking, we've got this missile defense system, and, because we've got missile defense, we can intercept any of the Russian missiles. So we've got now the ability for a first strike. We've got nuclear primacy, as they called it. And so that was very, exciting to these maniacs, but very terrifying to the rest of the world, because now all of a sudden the Pentagon thought, in its infinite wisdom, we now can, move forward with trying to conquer Russia and China because we can basically defend against their nuclear deterrence. And so, this is, again, why we saw all of these moves: Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Ukraine. All of these things are moved towards increasing the Western Empire's position near Russia and China to encircle them. And the purpose of that was for the missile defense shield. And then on the other side, it's South Korea, right? They're talking about putting it in South Korea for North Korean missiles, but the real target is China and Russia. And now this is being totally checked by hypersonic weaponry and craft that moves so fast that no missile defense system can intercept it. Continuing with this article, Putin explained, Moscow has scoffed at U.S. claims that its missile shield isn't intended to counter Russia's massive missile arsenals. And here is another headache for the U.S. and NATO. Earlier this week, Putin emphasized that Russia is the only country armed with hypersonic weapons, proudly noting that for the first time, Russia is leading the world in developing an entire new class of weapons, unlike in the past when it was catching up to the U.S. In December 2018, the Avangard was launched from the Dombarovsky missile base in the southern Urals and successfully hit a practice target in the Kura shooting range on Kamchatka, 6,000 kilometers away, 3,700 miles. And so, rather than read the rest of the article, I guess I'll just read this part right here. Needless to say, the U.S. is scrambling to find an effective deterrent to weapons that can collapse the conventional mutually assured destruction doctrine due to their unprecedented delivery speed. And U.S. officials have talked about putting a layer of sensors in space to more quickly detect enemy missiles, particularly hypersonic weapons. So this also, now you really get to see, coming into clear focus, why exactly Trump is implementing a Space Force, the sixth branch of the U.S. military, is because that is where the new theater of war is going to take place. Cyberspace, information technology, right? It's not just weapons anymore. Everything's computerized. So electromagnetic warfare, informational warfare, and now hypersonic warfare. It basically makes the advent of something like a Space Force inevitable. And these aren't the things that get talked about, to the public, right? These are the things that the Pentagon is talking about, though, and this is going to define war and hopefully the lack of war, but basically a new kind of Cold War and arms race over the next decade and years to come. So with that, I'll go to another article by Pepe Escobar. And this guy, maybe I'll be accused of Russian propaganda for this one, but Pepe Escobar is a fantastic journalist, and he covers geopolitical topics very well. I've been very impressed with his writing and info over the last few years. And this one, he really talks about a book that was published by Andrei Martyanov, who is one of the top military guys in Russia, and explaining this situation in a very real, clear sense, as opposed to the, again, political just nonsense and diplomatic, charades that the West goes through, just words that have no meaning. Whereas in Russia, when they speak, it's very clear cut what their priorities are. They're looking to expand Russia's power in the world, but they're very clear about that. Every single country in the world is, clear about that. But because the U.S. and the Western Empire and the cabal and they want to conquer Russia, they basically have to demonize Putin and make it seem like he's the ultimate bad guy. When in reality, they're just they're afraid that they're losing their window of that conquest of Russia, and the reason is because of these technologies that are coming forward. So this is Pepe Escobar. You say you want a Russian revolution. Andrei Martyanov's latest book provides unceasing evidence about the kind of lethality waiting for U.S. forces in a possible future war against real armies, not the Taliban or Saddam Hussein's. Once in a blue moon, an indispensable book comes out making a clear case for sanity in what is now a post-mad world. That's the responsibility carried by The Real Revolution in Military Affairs by Andrei Martyanov, arguably the most important book of 2019. Martyanov is the total package, and he comes with extra special attributes in it as a top-flight Russian military analyst, born in Baku and back in those USSR days, living and working in the US and writing and blogging in English. Right from the start, Martyanov wastes no time destroying not only Fukuyama's and Huntington's ravings, but especially Graham Allison's childish and meaningless Thucydides trap argument, as if the power equation between the US and China in the 21st century could be easily interpreted in parallel to Athens and Sparta slouching towards the Peloponnesian War over 2,400 years ago. What next? Xi Jinping as the new Genghis Khan? And for context, Thucydides trap is the academic concept that the rising of one great power, to displace an existing great power, usually ends in warfare. And it's based off of, Thucydides, the ancient historian, and the rise of Athens versus Sparta. And so Sparta attacked Athens sort of preemptively as their power was, of Athens was rising. And then all of Greece, essentially, it was kind of like a little world war within the Grecian world. Continuing with the article. By the way, the best current essay on Thucydides is in Italian by Luciano Canfora, Thucydides, la menzogna, la colpa e l'esilio. No trap. Martyanov visibly relishes defining the trap as a figment of the imagination of people who have a very vague understanding of real warfare in the 21st century. No wonder Xi explicitly said the trap does not exist. Martyanov had already detailed in his splendid previous book, Losing Military Supremacy, the myopia of American strategic planning, how American lack of historic experience with continental warfare ended up planting the seeds of ultimate destruction of the American military mythology of the 20th and 21st centuries, which is foundational to the American decline due to hubris and detachment of reality. Throughout his book, he unceasingly provides solid evidence about the kind of lethality waiting for U.S. forces in a possible future war against real armies, not the Taliban or Saddam Hussein's, air forces, air defense, and naval power. Do the math. One of the key takeaways is the failure of the U.S. mathematical models, and readers of the book do need to digest quite a few mathematical equations. The key point is that this failure led the U.S. on a continuous downward spiral of diminishing military capabilities against the nation she thought she defeated in the Cold War. In the U.S., Revolution in Military Affairs, RMA, was introduced by the late Andrew Marshall, aka Yoda, the former head of net assessment at the Pentagon and the de facto inventor of the pivot to Asia concept. Yet Martynov tells us that RMA actually started as MTR, Military Technological Revolution, introduced by Soviet military theoreticians back in the 1970s. One of the staples of RMA concerns nations capable of producing land attack cruise missiles, aka TLAMs. As it stands, only the US, Russia, China, and France can do it. And there are only two global systems providing satellite guidance to cruise missiles, the American GPS and the Russian GLONASS. Neither China's Beidou nor the European Galileo qualify yet as global GPS systems. Then there's net-centric warfare. The term itself was coined by the late Admiral Arthur Sabrowski in 1998 in an article he co-wrote with John Garskas titled Network-Centric Warfare, Its Origin and Future. Deploying his mathematical equations, Martynov soon tells us that the era of subsonic anti-shipping missiles is over. NATO, that brain-dead organism, copyright Emmanuel Macron, now has to face the supersonic Russian P-800 Onyx in the caliber-class M54 in a highly hostile electronic warfare environment. Every developed modern military today applies net-centric warfare, NCW, developed by the Pentagon in the 1990s. Martynov mentions in his new book something that I learned during my visit to Donbass in Ukraine in March 2015, how NCW principles, based on Russia's capabilities made available by the Russian military to numerically inferior armed forces of the Donbass republics, were used to devastating effect both at the battles of Ilovaisk and Debaltsevo when attacking the cumbersome Soviet-era Ukrainian armed forces military. No escape from the Kinzhal. Martynov provides ample information on Russia's latest missile, the hypersonic Mach 10 aeroballistic Kinzhal recently tested in the Arctic. Crucially, as he explains, no existing anti-missile defense in the U.S. Navy is capable of shooting it down even in the case of the detection of this missile. Kinzhal has a range of 2,000 kilometers, which leaves its carriers, MiG-31K and Tu-22 M3M, invulnerable to the only defense a U.S. carrier battle group, a main pillar of U.S. naval power, can mount: carrier fighter aircraft. These fighters simply don't have the range. The Kinzhal was one of the weapons announced by Russian President Vladimir Putin's game-changing March 1, 2018 speech at the Federal Assembly. That's the day, Martynov stresses, that the real RMA arrived and changed completely the face of peer-to-peer warfare, competition, and global power balance dramatically. Top Pentagon officials such as General Hyten, vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs, have admitted on the record there are no existing countermeasures against, for instance, the hypersonic Mach 27 glide vehicle Avangard, which renders anti-ballistic missile systems useless, telling the U.S. Senate Armed Forces Committee the only way out would be a nuclear deterrent. There are also no existing countermeasures against anti-shipping missiles such as the Zircon and Kinzhal. Any military analyst knows very well how the Kinzhal destroyed a land target the size of a Toyota Corolla in Syria after being launched 1,000 kilometers away in adverse weather conditions. The corollary is the stuff of NATO nightmares. NATO's command and control installations in Europe are de facto indefensible. Martynov gets straight to the point. The introduction of hypersonic weapons surely pours some serious cold water on the American obsession of securing the North American continent from retaliatory strikes. Here's a photo of that Mach 10 missile attached to the bottom of one of their aircraft, the Russian aircraft. Martynov is thus unforgiving on U.S. policymakers who lack the necessary toolkit for grasping the unfolding geostrategic reality in which the real revolution in military affairs had dramatically downgraded the always inflated American military capabilities and continues to redefine U.S. geopolitical status away from its self-declared hegemony. And it gets worse. Such weapons ensure a guaranteed retaliation, Martynov's italics, on the U.S. proper. Even the existing Russian nuclear deterrents, and to a lesser degree Chinese, as paraded recently, are capable of overcoming the existing U.S. anti-ballistic systems and destroying the United States, no matter what crude propaganda the Pentagon is peddling. In February 2019, Moscow announced the completion of tests of a nuclear-powered engine for the Petrel cruise missile. This is a subsonic cruise missile with nuclear propulsion that can remain in air for quite a long time, covering intercontinental distances and able to attack from the most unexpected directions. Martynov mischievously characterizes the Petrel as a vengeance weapon in case some among American decision-makers who may help precipitate a new world war might try to hide from the effects of what they have unleashed in the relative safety of the Southern Hemisphere. Hybrid war gone berserk. A section of the book expands on China's military progress and the fruits of the Russia-China strategic partnership, such as Beijing buying $3 billion worth of S-400 Triumph anti-aircraft missiles, ideally suited to deal with the exact type of strike assets the United States would use in case of a conventional conflict with China. Because of the timing, the analysis does not even take into consideration the arsenal presented in early October at the Beijing parade celebrating the 70th anniversary of the People's Republic. That includes, among other things, the carrier killer DF-21D designed to hit warships at sea at a range of up to 1,500 kilometers, the intermediate range Guam killer DF-26, the DF-17 hypersonic missile, and the long-range submarine-launched and ship-launched YJ-18A anti-ship cruise missiles. Not to mention the DF-41 ICBM, the backbone of China's nuclear deterrent, capable of reaching the U.S. mainland carrying multiple warheads. Martyanov could not escape addressing the Rand Corporation, whose reason to exist is to relentlessly push for more money for the Pentagon, blaming Russia for hybrid war, an American invention, even as it moans about the U.S.'s incapacity of defeating Russia in each and every war game. Rand's war games pitting the U.S. and allies against Russia and China invariably ended in a catastrophe for the finest fighting force in the world. Martyanov also addresses the S-500s, capable of reaching AWACS planes and possibly even capable of intercepting hypersonic non-ballistic targets. The S-500 and its latest middle-range, state-of-the-art air defense system, S-350 Vityaz, will be operational in 2020. His key takeaway: there is no parity between Russia and the United States in such fields as air defense, hypersonic weapons, and in general missile development, to name just a few. The United States lags behind in these fields, not just in years, but in generations. All across the global south, scores of nations are very much aware that the U.S. economic order, rather disorder, is on the brink of collapse. In contrast, a cooperative, connected, rule-based foreign relations between sovereign nations model is being advanced in Eurasia, symbolized by the merging of the New Silk Roads or Belt and Road Initiative, the Eurasia Economic Union, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, and the NDB, which is the BRICS Bank. The key guarantors of the new model are Russia and China, and Beijing and Moscow harbor no illusion whatsoever about the toxic dynamics in Washington. My recent conversations with top analysts in Kazakhstan last month and in Moscow last week once again stressed the futility of negotiating with people described, with overlapping shades of sarcasm, as exceptionalist fanatics. Russia, China, and many corners of Eurasia have figured out there are no possible meaningful deals with a nation bent on breaking every deal. Indispensable? No. Vulnerable. Martyanov cannot but evoke Putin's speech to the Federal Assembly in February 2019 after the unilateral Washington abandonment of the INF Treaty, Intermediate Nuclear Forces, I believe, clearing the way for a U.S. deployment of intermediate and close-range missiles stationed in Europe and pointed at Russia. Quote, Russia will be forced to create and deploy those type of weapons against those regions from where we will face a direct threat, but also against those regions hosting the centers where decisions are taken on using those missile systems threatening us, end quote. Translation: American invulnerability is over for good. In the short term, things can always get worse. At his traditional year-end presser in Moscow lasting almost 4.5 hours, Putin stated that Russia is more than ready to simply renew the existing New START agreement, which is bound to expire in early 2021. They, the U.S., can send us the agreement tomorrow, or we can sign and send it to Washington. And yet, so far our proposals have been left unanswered. If the New START ceases to exist, nothing in the world will hold back an arms race. I believe this is bad. Bad is quite the euphemism. Martyanov prefers to stress how most of the American elites, at least for now, still reside in a state of Orwellian cognitive dissonance, even as the real revolution in military affairs blew the myth of American conventional invincibility out of the water. Martyanov is one of the very few analysts, always from different parts of Eurasia, who have warned about the danger of the U.S. accidentally stumbling into a war against Russia, China, or both, which is impossible to be won conventionally, let alone through the nightmare of global nuclear catastrophe. Is that enough to instill at least a modicum of sense into those who lord over that massive cash cow, the military-industrial security complex? Don't count on it. So yeah, I thought that was a pretty enlightening article, and again, this is essentially the beginning of what is a de facto Cold War, and there are only real two conclusions. and it's very much tied to what's happening in this country with our domestic politics in the United States, is that if the deep state and the swamp creatures retain power, and Trump is the last of his line of patriotic Republican leaders of the country, then the potential exists for these complete maniacs to keep pushing, even in the face of this new technological reality, and creating not just a Cold War, but a very devastating nuclear hot war. That's the worst case scenario. Even the Cold War extended scenario is also very bad. It doesn't, leave very much for the average people of this world that just want to build a productive and successful life. But the alternative here, and again, why what Trump is doing in foreign policy is so much more important than even the little shenanigans that he's gotten into in this country, and why I don't care about a bump stock ban. I care about rapprochement and detente with Russia and China, and building a new world order, which is the absolute only alternative to the old New World Order, which is based on the hegemony of the Western banking system. If we can work with the new reality of a multipolar world, we can, which is Trump is trying to do. He's trying to talk to Putin. He's trying to talk to Xi Jinping. He's trying to use his deal-making ability to build this new structure. And, in the process, severing this connection to the European Union, and not using these countries as just satellites of our military empire, but him saying, you know what, you pay for your own weapons, is a very subtle and effective, at least effective for his campaign, way of getting them to essentially not just stop being on our payroll, but also to distance ourselves strategically from them and allow for this multipolar world to come into being. Especially with Brexit, the UK is getting closer to the United States, and Trump's United States, to use the term, while Merkel and Macron are trying to move closer to Russia, right? So it's the more that we can again build that fragmented aspect. It might sound terrible to the deep state and the people reading the New York Times, but it's very, very good. A balance of power is what prevents war. And this is a very critical time. China is about to decouple from the U.S. GPS network, as mentioned in the previous article. The Chinese system has not been a fully global system, but it is about to be. And this will mean that essentially they will have their own hypersonic weapons coming online very soon here. So that is a very huge development. And then on the other side, again, in the Space Force aspect, this is Michael Snyder. He's, usually pretty alarmist with his articles, but this at least pointed at something very interesting, which is Russia and the U.S. are both currently developing plans to deal with incoming asteroids. So again, the focus of the new world order, I believe, based on all the going back to the Iron Mountain Report on the possibility and desirability of peace, they need to replace the function of war making in a global civilization. There has to be some organizing principle for society. Otherwise, there's no reason to have central governments. And for the anarchists, it wouldn't be so bad if we didn't have centralized governments. But for them, the need to retain some structure of society is, they're not going to just give it up. So it's non-negotiable for them to just surrender power. These are the aristocrats that have been in power for thousands of years, right? And this is really what we could see and what we should see if Trump is successful and we build this multipolar world, is these new technologies all coming together in a cooperative aspect for incoming space threats. And this might not be aliens, right? There's been plans to, use the made-up threat of aliens as a way to create a global government. But even things like asteroids and planetary defense systems for incoming near-Earth objects. That's a reason enough to, bring countries together. If an asteroid comes down, that's like all of us getting nuked, right? And we don't want that to happen. So hopefully we will see Trump be effective in his second term deal-making with Russia and China. We'll see this new Cold War kind of toned down a little bit, and we'll see more cooperation in the aspects of the Space Force and, building a new kind of global civilization, multipolar, based on rules, international law, where the U.S. doesn't just get to invade another country whenever it feels like it needs to, nor does China, nor does Russia. That would be a good world and a very much an improvement on the world that we've seen so far in what I call Fifth World. I don't think that the world is made a better place with, what the United States military and NATO has done in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya, in Ukraine. these things have made the world infinitely worse. And the whole migrant crisis, again, is an absolute direct consequence of this. So if we can see, a balance of power and, centered around the three great powers and their leaders, Trump, Xi, and Putin, over the next, 4 or 5 years, we could set ourselves on a very good track. And again, this also goes along with the cleaning out of the deep state, the solving of the immigration problem, and bringing back some modicum of balance and reality to American domestic politics. And I think the world and America will be much better as a result. So that's my video today. Hope you enjoyed it. 45 minutes, hopefully not too long. I'll be doing another video here before the year is out, and I'll see you guys next time. Cheers.